Yo, dudes, Monday. Right, let's start with an article from Herman Daly. Growth, Debt and the World Bank. When I was in graduate school in economics in the early 1960s, we were taught that capital was the limiting factor in growth and development. Just inject capital into the economy and it would grow. As the economy grew, you could then reinvest the growth increment as new capital and make it grow exponentially. Eventually, the economy would be rich. Originally, to get things started, capital came from savings, from confiscation, or from foreign aid or investment, but later out of the national growth increment itself. Capital embodied technology, the source of its power. Capital was magic stuff, but scarce. It all seemed convincing at the time. Many years later, when I worked for the World Bank, it was evident that capital was no longer the limiting factor. If it indeed had ever been, trillions of dollars of capital was circling the globe looking for projects in which to become invested so it could grow. The World Bank understood that the limiting factor was that thing called bankable projects. Those are concrete investments that could embody abstract financial capital. It's quite good that. Abstract financial capital, digits, embody it. Actually, a factory is an embodiment of ethereal monetary wealth, digits. So, embody, where was embody? Concrete investments that could embody abstract financial capital and make its value grow at an acceptable rate, usually 10% per annum or more, doubling every 7 years. That was more in the old days, so you're lucky to get that now. But at the price of capital, the further back you go, obviously the more expensive it was. Since there was not enough bankable projects to absorb the available financial capital, the World Bank decided to stimulate the creation of such projects with country development teams set up in the borrowing countries with the World Bank technical experience, and the article then goes on to show how that was really a con just for the World Bank bods to keep their jobs. But the important take from this opening article is the bankable projects idea. Plenty of capital out there, ethereal digits on computers that want to double their money, but they need bankable projects. Right, let's move on. All of this is quite deep. The concept I'm going to try and put over is deep today, and I'm not going to get to put it all over. So it's just the start of some pretty deep shit, man. Okay, this is from the Financial Times. You can tell by the pink. And their European banks and how much on their asset side of their books they have in sovereign debt and which sovereign debt. And you can run down each bank and interactively those great pink balloons will expand or contract on the various countries of Europe. I've just rolled over at the moment that BNP Paribas, France's biggest bank, and I think just about the biggest bank asset-wise in Europe at the moment, has about 100 billion in sovereign debt. It's come down a lot, actually. It's 82 now. It was 120 in the summer. So it's come down 40 billion, and most all of that will have gone to the European Central Bank. And open there is Italy. It's got 20 billion of Italian sovereign debt on the asset side of BNP's books, and in the summer it had 24 billion, so 4 billion's been offloaded probably to the ECB. But we ask ourselves, why has BNP got such a large amount, and 20 billion is a large amount, of Italian debt on its books? We're not going to answer that today because I'm just grinding out some concepts. Right, where are we now? This looks like it's the Archdruid report, so it's John Michael Greer, who is talking about the opening article by Herman Daly. The second, however, cuts far closer to the heart of our current predicament. Don't worry. The industrial economy, as it evolved from the 18th century onward, depended utterly on the ability to replace relatively expensive human labour with cheap fossil energy. The mills of the English Midlands mentioned above were able to destroy the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of independent spinners and weavers because, all things considered, it was far cheaper to build a spinning jenny or power loom and fuel it with coal than it was to pay for the skilled craftsmen and women who did the same work in an earlier day. In economic terms, in other words, industrialism is a system of arbitrage. Now, arbitrage is kind of the word of the week, and here I'm trying to introduce the idea of most things being arbitrage. Right, let's go on to Gail the Actuary, and her blog is called The Finite World. So Gail gives us Saudi Arabia headed for a downfall ? Saudi Arabia recently announced that it had halted a $100 billion oil production expansion plan to raise capacity to 15 million barrels a day by 2020. At this point, the country claims to have a capacity of 12 million barrels a day. And what does this mean for its future? Let's take a look behind the figures. And I might return to this article in future days and try and keep linking these things together. In the chart there, we have Saudi Arabia's oil production and consumption. Its entire production sticks up the most in grey, and then lots of exports, but that black line going through the green is their usage. So the more they use, the less they can export, and they're producing just a fraction under 10 million barrels a day at the moment, but they're using more and more of it. And you can see their production, although slightly up over the last 5 years, is really not that much increased from 1990, and its actual export amount is a long way down, or at least stepping down now, or not going up certainly. But for this presentation, the whole concept is Saudi Arabia can put its hands on $100 billion relatively easily, but it does not think that investing in its own country's oil production facilities is a bankable project. Now we really have to ask ourselves why. And as I say, it might come back to that tomorrow and the next day. Always going on with the same concept, but coming at it from different angles. There's so many different pieces to this. This is a Fed chart from a Grigor post. Now we've got total public and private debt, United States this time, and it's going from 150 up to 400% of GDP from 1980. 30 years it's gone 150 to 400% of GDP, and we have the Fed funds rate, the thing that's called the interest rate, which we can see has come down from 15% and has been at zero for the last 3 years at least. 3 years at least. And the idea here is the Fed saying, look, here is money, very, very cheap money. Surely when money's this cheap, you can go away and arbitrage it. You can find bankable projects. Now, here's where I'm introducing the idea that bankable projects is arbitrage, and arbitrage are bankable projects. At very, very, let's say 1% interest, can you not go and find a project where you can make more money out of this money? And we look at that blue line for 30 years going up, and people have been taking on more debt, which is in a way taking on borrowing money at a certain interest rate, presumably to arbitrage it up into a profit, because you're not going to borrow money expecting to make a loss. So there's been an awful lot of money borrowed over the last 30 years, and quite a lot of it has worked as arbitrage bankable projects, be they only buying a house, the house price goes up, borrow to do whatever. And it's worked. This is the private Ponzi scheme. And with the Fed slammed down on minimum interest rates, that's the question mark. Is this private Ponzi scheme coming to an end? That not even at 1% in the OECD world can we find bankable projects or arbitrage, things to do with that 1% money. Banks still can, but the private population can't. Finish here with a similar thing, but going over to Europe. Now, this is from Eurostat Morgan Stanley, so it's the European side, but I wouldn't be surprised if most OECD nations are pretty similar to this, going back to the early 1990s. So it's a good amount of time. GDP and private sector loans increase year on year. Now, we can say that when GDP goes up, then the private sector feels confident enough to go into the bank and get a loan. And that's why they are seemingly correlated. But we could also say that the GDP goes up because the private sector goes into banks and gets loans, and thereby throws more money into the economy. This is the private sector Ponzi scheme. Now, at the end of this, in the Europe, or let's just go to the middle and say that from this chart, it's very hard to see where's causation and where's correlation. If you look at above 1999, you'd think that the red peak comes before the grey peak, meaning that private sector loans seem to drive GDP, but the rest of it looks more like correlation, not causation. But at the end of this chart for Europe, something has got to give, because we have GDP hanging around at plus 2% year-on-year increase, and we have private sector loans at minus 3% year-on-year decrease. Now, either, if this correlation is to be continued, the European people are going to have to borrow a lot more money, take out private sector loans, enter into more private sector Ponzi, or that GDP grey line has got to go down to meet the red line, just to keep the correlation. But it's been pretty cute, the correlation up to now. All to do with arbitrage and whether it's worth borrowing the money to make that little bit extra. And the more people borrow money to make that little bit extra, the more money there is in the economy. But if there aren't those bankable projects or arbitrage opportunities out there, and people don't borrow to put the extra into the economy like they have for the last 30 years, that is the end of the private Ponzi. I shall return more to this tomorrow, hopefully, unless other things happen. Bye.